Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session this afternoon on loss and damage in humanitarian finance. My name is Richard Choularton. I'm wearing two hats today. I'm a researcher at Lund University, and I'm also the Vice President of Operations at Tetra, a global environment and international development consulting firm. I'm really pleased to have a great panel to discuss practical lessons from humanitarian disaster risk finance for the Loss and Damage Fund. That's been the #1 story at COP28 this year, is the historic approval of the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. And the humanitarian system for decades has been improving the mechanisms at the global level, regional levels, and local levels that it uses to make sure that finance can flow quickly to local communities around the world to deal with the consequences of climate and other disasters. I'm going to give a brief presentation on some of the context of humanitarian disaster risk finance, and then we're going to discuss with our panelists, Gernot Laganda, the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction from the United Nations World Food Programme, Kirsten Hagon from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and Nelly Maonde from the START Network, all innovators in humanitarian disaster risk finance and major technical advisors to many of the parties who have been working to set up the Loss and Damage Fund through the COP process. Over the last year, we've done research commissioned by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance through their USAID Climate Adaptation Support activity to map humanitarian disaster risk finance and understand what mechanisms exist and some of the trends in humanitarian risk finance at the moment. And so I'm just going to give a brief snapshot of some of the key points to set the stage for today's discussion. Humanitarian disaster risk finance covers a whole range of different, what we call windows of opportunity. Some that activate before disasters occur. We've all heard of anticipatory action and forecast-based financing. Some that happen and are released when disasters occur, immediate response funds, and others that fund large-scale response to major disasters, reconstruction, and recovery. When you start to look at those finance mechanisms, we often, especially in the climate change negotiations, focus on the appeals process. I know you can't read my bubbles, and I'm very sorry for their size. In other words, we focus on the process of, after a disaster occurs, doing an assessment, launching a humanitarian appeal, and the slow process of mobilizing large-scale finance for response. But in fact, the humanitarian system has a number of different mechanisms in addition to that process. That process is very important. It represents $50 billion a year in 2023, up from $30 billion in 2022. So that is a huge amount of money dealing with all kinds of humanitarian crises, including climate disasters, but also including conflicts and other humanitarian disasters. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that there are many, many other mechanisms out there. Immediate response funds, supply chain finance mechanisms, insurance mechanisms, anticipatory action mechanisms. What's been really interesting in the humanitarian system is that traditional contingency funds, immediate response funds like the CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund, or WFP's Immediate Response Fund, or the Disaster Emergency Response Fund of the Red Cross, they have provided grant finance after disasters for years. Those funds are innovating, adding anticipatory windows, adding insurance elements, and they're large. They're capitalized at over $1 billion. All of the large funds now have anticipatory windows, and some are adding insurance layers to make their finance more efficient. There's also been a significant trend towards integrating parametric insurance, particularly through regional risk pools. Regional risk pools have been one of, I think, the most important outcomes of the UNFCCC process in terms of action outside the convention that's been driven by the convention process, mechanisms like the Africa risk capacity. And the humanitarian sector has partnered with those pools to improve its ability not only to finance their activities, but to work more closely with national governments on their response capacities. The other point that I wanted to highlight was that increasingly we're seeing more and more structured approaches to country-level networked funding, where global humanitarian organizations and networks are working to support local networks of humanitarian organizations to disperse money more directly through local communities. And so that's something that I really want to talk with the panel, because that's one of the critical elements in the loss and damage fund text. So, oh yes, and one more thing. There's an increasing trend towards integrating humanitarian disaster risk finance with shock-responsive social protection systems. For a number of years, governments around the world have really been strengthening their social protection systems and working with humanitarian organizations and with others, the World Bank, for example, to integrate this kind of finance into shock-responsive social protection systems to enable faster delivery of assistance to the most vulnerable populations. So there's some really important lessons from that work for the Loss and Damage Fund about how to get resources that people need to them quickly through these kind of global mechanisms. So that's just a brief snapshot of what we found when we mapped out humanitarian disaster risk finance and some of the things that I want to talk with the panel about today. But really the question I want to ask the panel is, in some ways, a simple one. What are some of the real practical lessons that you've had over the last few years as you've innovated in disaster risk finance that the Loss and Damage Fund can learn from? So maybe we'll come this way. I'll start with you, Kirsten, and then Nelly and Gernot. So over to you.
Oh, it already works. I don't need to press anything. Fabulous. So a couple of things I think that we've learnt, and just thinking about what's about to be demanded from the fund. So first of all, to say the fund, and a couple of people have asked me this today, the fund does not yet exist. A few people have said, how do we apply for money from the fund? The Loss and Damage Fund is going to be set up over the next year. And one of the demands on the fund is going to be speed, and another demand on the fund is going to be that it reaches some of the most vulnerable populations. And there has also been a discussion around how to have it accessible by local communities. And all of these things are, in many ways, an opposition to the way in which big climate funds work. They're not fast, they're not accessible by local communities, and they often struggle to reach the most vulnerable communities, particularly those that might be in fragile and conflict-affected states. So there's a few big challenges this fund will have to overcome. In terms of some of the things that we have learned, one of the things I would say is that the only way to get money somewhere fast is to take a lot of time setting up the systems to do so. So if I think about how our anticipatory action window for the DREF works, so the DREF is our fund that delivers very, very fast money whenever you have a disaster, and it also works in advance of a disaster. So it has 25% of it is allocated for anticipatory action. So to set that up, what we need is something called an early action protocol. I think we're listening to a few other people as well. So in order to set up an early action protocol that when you hit a specific, for example, a category of storm, it's a certain level, we know a certain number of people are going to be impacted, it's going to be a certain severity in a community where there is an early action protocol, you can, with just the forecast, trigger funding to go to people so that they can, for example, evacuate. fairly simple. The challenge is to set up that early action protocol, the agreements between the government, the community, the IFRC, the National Society, all of those that are involved in doing it, takes around 3 years. And so one of the primary messages I would say for this particular fund is if they want to be able to act quickly, you've really got to invest in advance in communities. The pieces of the puzzle that we have that make it a little bit easier is that we have national societies with local branches in all of these communities, and we do what are called vulnerability and capacity assessment. So there's a lot of the groundwork that is put in place. So this first thing I think is around investing in preparedness and the capacity at the local level to respond. I think one other point that I would like to make, and I know that my colleagues will raise a lot of really good points, so I don't need to go through all of them, but maybe one other one that's worth noting in particular is just around speed versus scale. So the difference between humanitarian and the big climate funds is we are often much, much smaller amounts of money going to a wide variety of local organizations, national organizations, and so on. And we're able to get it quickly to the local level, but it's small amounts. And we have a different risk threshold. And so I think one of the things this fund is going to need to look at is to work out where are they going to be on that scale. If you've got a scale between the massive climate funds that go only to governments and take 3 years long application process to get there versus a humanitarian fund that's going to be only $1 million at most, going straight to the local communities in 24 hours, you've got to find yourself somewhere on that scale. And you've got to find a way of having a process for applying that is accessible for local and national organizations and not too cumbersome and time-consuming. Over to others, though.
Thanks, Kirsten. Nelly, over to you.
Thank you very much. So for me, I want to start by saying it's actually exciting to see the parties agreeing on this fund very early in the COP. I was just looking at one document that the what are they calling it? The transitional committee that has been set up to actually lead on the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. They actually highlight our 3 funds. They highlight the DREF, they highlight the SAFE funds. They also highlight our START network, our funding instruments like START Ready, which we launched in COP28. So it's exciting to see that, and they recognize how we complement the loss and damage fund. So for me, I think she's highlighted some of actually the concerns that we see. Around it. I think what is still hazy right now is the details of how will it work. We still have like, the pledges are exciting to see the numbers growing, but of course you are still asking yourself, if we don't control the emissions, if the temperature's going high, there's a disproportionate linkages with the figures that we need in the event we don't really stick to these commitments of reducing the temperatures to make them go down and those targets. It would mean we would see more and more people needing help, and in billions by 2030, worse by 2050. So I think those are some of the things that I think we're still trying to figure out, like the commitments beyond what we're hearing, beyond the figures we're seeing put, what will it look like going forward? But also, something that you lightly inferred around how will it actually work in terms of what we want to see on ground. For example, access by local actors. A START network, really our vision is around the locally led humanitarian action. How would that work? Access by local actors, what would that look like? So some of those areas are still hazy. I did touch on the START Ready that we launched at COP28, which now is in its second, we are on the second pool. We are now going to pool 3. So of course there is limited learning from it, but some of the things that we've experienced from it is just around the issues of aspects of, again, like maybe the technical versus operational aspects, like how do we ensure that?
Nelly, could you just tell the audience what Start Ready does?
All right. So basically, Start Ready, it's it's another global pool fund. In fact, like at the global level, it's coming to join the likes of DREF by the Red Cross, the likes of the UNICEF funds. So if you Google "Is the Start Ready?" we can also share more about it after this session. It's a pooled fund that is also looking at a predictable or some of those predictable crises, like major crises like cyclones, heat waves, drought. And it's about pre-positioning it as well. So when we launched it 2 years ago, a lot of our donors who are already funding our other funding instrument at global level agreed to this other second pot of funds at global level. The difference with it is that, again, it works with hazard that can be modeled, and if it can be modeled, then we can already look at predetermined triggers. And then with the network, we are basically a network of close to 100 local, national, and international INGOs. We, in countries that have like these major hazards that are a high risk, the members can pre-plan around it. And then each year they make a coverage application for that risk. And at global level, we are pulling it, and that allows us to stretch. So for instance, if we go for multi-country, multi-risks in the one pool, that allows us to stretch the funds. So I'll give an example. In the pool 2 that we're working on, we had like 5.5, and through the pooling system, we're able to stretch it like about 1.6 times. That brings it to like 7.3 million, and that allows us to actually stretch in terms of the number of risks that we can cover. So yeah, so it's one of those funds that has joined the other initiatives at global level, like what she just explained, in the UN one. We are all jointly trying to see how do we complement some of these initiatives through the Loss and Damage Fund. So I'll just go back into, some of the challenges for us. Like I said, it's also new. We only launched it 2 years ago. So there are still aspects around, the evidence of how it's working. We are just starting, so we are still putting in systems around quality assurance, procedures, and things like digitalizing it. So there's still some learning, but we don't want to really rush. Maybe in the next COP29, we'll be sharing more of that. But it is working. It is helping a lot in terms of stretching the funds, but also having pre-arranged financing so that we really capture that window of opportunity that exists before the communities are affected by disasters.
Thanks, Nelly. I think that's such an important initiative to follow, because it is one that pushes funding out to hundreds of local organizations, which is one of the key objectives of the Loss and Damage Fund. And some of your points build on Kirsten's, that it's really the groundwork that makes the fast disbursement possible. Gernot, WFP is the world's largest frontline humanitarian organization with one of the longest histories in humanitarian disaster risk finance. What would you advise the new board of the Loss and Damage Fund? What practical lessons has WFP learned?
Yeah. Thanks for the invite. It's nice to have this conversation. The first thing I would probably advise them on is, like, do not create your own little loss and damage universe. See the loss and damage discussion in the context of all these lines of defense that stand between a climate shock and a vulnerable household, right? The first line of defense is still climate change mitigation, right? If we now start to sequester ourselves in this world of loss and damage and forget about really the big trends, I think we are not making much progress. As humanitarians, we are really not actively, I think, driving this mitigation debate, but we're certainly trying to establish the link between humanitarian needs and the overheating climate. The second line of defense is climate change adaptation. And again, for many humanitarians, this is a bit of a new territory, but WFP, for example, is accredited with the Green Climate Fund, the only humanitarian agency that is accredited. We work with adaptation projects mostly in places where development actors have a more difficult time operating, in the Iraqs and in the Somalias and the Haitis. So there are spaces where humanitarian agencies can work with adaptation funding, but on the global scale, adaptation after 28 years of COPs has still been too little too late. And the UNEP adaptation gap report speaks a very clear language. About 21 billion US dollars are available in adaptation financing, but this is only a 10th to a 15th to what is necessary every year. So the adaptation gap is massive. The next line of defense that we then have is what we would call protection. Protection in the, not in the sense of humanitarian protection once we're already in an emergency, but in the sense of what can we do now to shield communities that do not have the luxury to wait until the emission curve is bending or the Green Climate Fund basically approves new projects. What can we do now to protect people next season and not in a few years from now? And then this is where many of the solutions that you have projected on your screen come in. Disaster preparedness planning, I think, is a very, very simple, low-tech and long-established discipline that still remains underfunded, right? Contingency planning. What do we do as a government, as an NGO community, as a UN, if a particular hazard starts to hit? Who does what? Insurance protection. There are by now these risk pools that enable humanitarian organizations and governments, and I think the START network and WFP are a good example of that, to also buy insurance coverage. And then when there is a payout, to crowd it into an early humanitarian response that saves time and basically mobilizes additional financing that otherwise would have to be raised through an appeals process. Anticipatory action, connecting early warning triggers with pre-positioned financing. Again, there, I think we are globally not at the level where we should be. Around 2% of all the aid financing is pre-positioned. This is nowhere near where we could be. So we are still working with an age-old model of waiting for things to happen, then raising funding, and then wondering why we are not closing the humanitarian needs gap. But that said, the effectiveness and the efficiency of anticipatory action has by now been proven. So we have, I think in WFP, 5 years of testing and trying this out under our belt. The challenges are probably there, that depending on the hazard type, whether you're looking at a drought risk, a flood hazard, or at a storm or a heat wave hazard, you need different anticipatory actions, and we need to understand which combinations really work best in order to reduce humanitarian need. I think for the fast onset hazards like floods and tropical storms, an early cash transfer is a very effective way of doing things. When it comes to drought, where we have longer lead times, more uncertainty, a cash transfer is not as effective. It needs to be coupled with other solutions like livestock protection. So we are trying to figure out together as a humanitarian community which bundles of activities make the most sense. And if then this last line of protection, the mitigation line, the adaptation line, the protection line, if that fails too, then there's the humanitarian response line, which at the moment is unfortunately the default in which we manage climate risk, especially in fragile settings. And that, as you know, I think is also hugely underfunded with a funding gap of around 50% this year. But my main message here is all these 4 lines of defense need to really be driven forward by us as an international community in conjunction with each other, rather than now saying, okay, we failed on mitigation, we failed on adaptation, now why don't we focus on loss and damage?
Thanks, Gernot. Yeah, really, really interesting points. One of the things that I find most troubling is, despite the fact that we know that climate risks are increasing and therefore climate disasters are affecting more people, and we know that half of humanitarian crises are predictable with early warning systems, and a quarter of them can be modeled with some certainty, that only 2%, as you said, of humanitarian finance is pre-positioned. And that means the money is used inefficiently. Nelly, I was really interested to hear your statistics that in Start Ready, of the 5.5 million using risk pooling and insurance mechanisms, you're able to stretch that to 7.7 million dispersed, which is really interesting. Could you talk a little bit about how important partnerships are with governments and local organizations and global humanitarian actors to build the kind of capacities and do the kind of preparedness that that all three of you have highlighted. What are some of the success stories there in building those partnerships and building capacities through the deployment of better risk financing mechanisms?
Thank you. I just want to start by saying thanks a lot for highlighting those statistics, the 2%, and we know that almost 55% of these predictable risks, like only 55% of the funding is like 55% of the disasters are predictable, yet only the 2%. Okay, maybe coming to the issue of the way we approach it. For us at the START network, we realize that I think we're always saying that, you know, the role of protecting citizens, if it's not a failed state, needs to lie with the state. And so much as we as actors, we're independent, but we also want to think about the sustainability of whatever we're doing. So in most of the initiatives, I did talk about the START Ready, because that is what is a START network funding instrument, or pooled funding instrument at global level. But we also have the Africa Risk Capacity, where jointly with WFP and more recently the UNHCRs, we've joined forces with the African Union member states to look at how to prepare for early actions in the event of major disasters like drought, flooding, cyclones, and through transferring the risk, part of the risk to insurance, where the government purchases a primary policy, then we replicate it. In some contexts where the risk is very high, they might go for multiple partners. So we have countries like Somalia, where we went in, and now WFP is coming in. At the moment, UNHCR is in Malawi. The idea is that we complement the governments. So for us, apart from the complementing component, we're also seeing it as an opportunity to be building systems that are meant to really take the primary responsibility of protecting its citizens. So what we do is that much as we are running independent, what can I say, independent financing, when, for example, we buy insurance premium and there's a payout, the government would get a corresponding payout to the premium that they would have purchased. So would UNWFP, so would the START network, so would the UNHCR. However, in terms of the planning, or what we talk about around setting up systems for effective management of these risks, we are moving together with the governments. If it's around analyzing the risks and looking at the historical profile of the risk and setting up the thresholds, that's a process that we're doing together with these member states. The idea is that, you know, we can allow for some capacity strengthening in the process. We can allow for joint learning. We can also allow for joint accountability. In most cases, as the humanitarian, maybe civil society sector, sometimes we're like, the government is not accountable. But sometimes if you use a confrontational approach, sometimes you just block influence. So for us, it's like, because we're working together, we can strategize and say, hey, the way this is being done, how do we approach the government? But already we're on the same table when we are planning, so that gives us lots of opportunity to influence them. I'll give you an example on things like timeliness of the response. In most countries, for example, when disaster strikes, even for just early response, they'll take forever on the assessments. Nobody's thinking what is happening to those households that are affected. Now that we're working together, we can talk about, you know, how vulnerability assessments are done much early, so that we can actually take care of the early action window. We are currently working a lot across Africa, and again, jointly with all my counterparts sitting here, IFRC, WFP, and others who are not here, like UN OCHA, FAO, and the different other actors, to look at even things like models, harmonization of models, joint development of models, so that we avoid like duplication of efforts or misuse of resources, because we're just doing the same thing. We can actually do that together, but also it's creating an opportunity for a lot of cross-learning, so that, you know, whatever we are doing, we are all collectively working towards saving these communities that are at risk better.
Thanks, Nelly. Kirsten or Gernot, any thoughts on that question?
In terms of successes or in terms of gaps?
Sure.
Okay. Maybe a couple of things, just thinking again about what is going to be wanted from the Loss and Damage Fund and what is needed. The clear thing that what the Loss and Damage Fund needs to do is to be filling gaps that are out there. And as Gernot mentioned, one of the biggest gaps is actually in adaptation. If you don't mitigate first, you have to adapt. If you don't adapt, then you have to deal with loss and damage. And so I think the first piece before we even get to the Loss and Damage Fund is let's reduce the amount that is needed in it by thoroughly investing in adaptation. In terms of what the Loss and Damage Fund will need to cover, there are a couple of current gaps that I think are important to point out. The first one I would say is in terms of slow onset. What is going to happen to people who will lose their territory, who will lose their culture, who will lose their homes? That is a huge gap, and there isn't really a clear way forward in terms of how the fund will deal with this. And I don't have the answers on that, but I think it's a really important question to be resolved. A second gap is going to be which are the communities that are being left out. And in terms of what you said about positive lessons learned and successes, one of the things that which our work has shown is things like the anticipatory action that we've been talking about can actually work in fragile and conflict-affected states. And so we're certainly seeing that it is possible to reach the community level. For example, we have early action protocols that have been set up in Mali that have been successfully triggered and that have saved lives and livelihoods, enabling people to evacuate with their livestock, return home safely. So I think there is an important piece about it is possible, you just have to work out how. The other big gap, I would say, is around recovery. So if I look at another one of our success stories, and to give you a concrete example, we had Cyclone Freddy in Malawi earlier this year, which was really quite horrific. It was a massive, massive storm that affected so many communities. And one of the things we saw is in the communities where we had a long-term presence, so we'd been there for many years, the communities knew the National Red Cross Society. They knew what happened, what you were meant to do when you got an early warning system. The loss of lives was incredibly low. So there was really huge numbers of lives were saved, but it was because of the presence. Now, because the storm was so massive, the Red Cross Society was asked to do exactly the same thing in communities where they didn't have a presence. And there we discovered that we just weren't as successful in saving lives. So the success was built on the fact the community knew us and knew what to do because they'd been through it before. And so I think that's a really important point to be aware of, just again in terms of how much of the pre-work is needed at the local level. And then the other thing to point out is the big gap that we saw in Malawi was the lack of money available for a resilient recovery. And so what you're seeing is that people who were evacuated from their houses, they go back to their houses and there's no money to rebuild them. And if they do rebuild them, they're going to be exactly the same or even less standard and more likely to be destroyed next time, instead of actually investing in building something that will last. Now, we managed to get a really small grant to the Malawi Red Cross, who did build, after the last storm, a small number of sort of climate, what shall we call them, storm resilient houses. None of them were destroyed. And so that community was able to go home and go back to normal instead of having to dig into whatever savings they had to try and rebuild for the second, third, or fourth time. And so I think if there's a way the Loss and Damage Fund can really fill that resilient recovery gap, in the long term, it's going to make such a difference in people's lives. And it connects back to what Gernot was saying about the importance of actually investing in adaptation, because they come together. They're not part of different universes.
Thanks, Kirsten. Good.
You go on, sorry.
Gernot, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think the challenges and the opportunities, they are for us a little bit in the same space. As a humanitarian system, we are very distribution focused, right? Our whole operating models, the processes, the skills in the workforce, they are about distributing things after a shock has happened. But effective solutions to really minimize and address loss and damage are a little bit more related to building different systems. So we need to get from also from this mindset of doing everything ourselves and distributing things to enabling institutions at national government level, local government level, to work with these risk financing mechanisms. The opportunity lies there as well, because for example, when we work with insurance mechanisms, that really gets governments to think about fiscal resilience. They think about, okay, how, if there now a particular disaster happens, how much money would we have to mobilize in order to address this? And are we ready for that? Especially, I think, in the Caribbean region, where one tropical storm can wipe out 20-30% of your GDP in one hazard. There are these very, very strong considerations about fiscal resilience. And then working through or with insurance-based mechanisms makes you think this through, especially when we do it together. Then there is also then this idea of what do we do if there is an impact with the payout. So that systems building is important. On the other side, in some countries, especially those that have social protection systems, these insurance payouts, they can be channeled into or through a social protection system. Then, a government turns a social protection system that is normally there to just distribute some support to reduce poverty. All of a sudden, it turns into a disaster risk financing instrument if you can fill it fast enough and in a targeted way, and using the targeting mechanisms of the humanitarian sector to get the money disproportionately more to the people who are in harm's way. So there are these systems building elements which are potentially huge for a government. Our challenge is that we also need to, I think, grow in this space together with our government partners, because we also have a long tradition of logistics, emergency logistics. That will always be necessary, but I think the new generation of humanitarians will become a little bit more versatile, working with different risk financing systems and then plugging it with that capacity strengthening at government level. Thanks,
Gernot. Really great points. Lots of interesting things happening, but also some serious gaps. I mean, the point, Kirsten, you made about financing for resilient recovery, I think, is a major gap. It's a major gap the humanitarian system's been flagging for a long time, and hopefully we can see some more attention to that. Unfortunately, I think there won't be much time for adaptation except between disasters in many places. So we better do it when we can. We've got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. I'm Lionel from Civic Exchange, a Hong Kong-based think tank. And it sounds like with the work that you've done in very vulnerable and emerging markets, these are hard-learned lessons, which I think a lot of developed markets don't always learn, because I think they've sort of almost by nature have entrenched more like resilient systems, but that's changing over time. Like in Hong Kong, we've had a few very extreme weather events that were on the tail end that we haven't seen before in the last year, and those have been extremely disruptive. And you don't know how to adapt to this until it's happened. So I'm wondering if there are lessons that you've learned in the work that you would recommend, a city like Hong Kong should adopt before. We don't want to learn that lesson the hard way. We'd like to learn that from what you've sort of experienced already. So what can we do as a developed city to learn from what you've experienced?
Thanks very much. That's a really great question. I live in the US, in Vermont. We had the worst floods in 100 years this year, and our climate change projections tell us that's going to become more and more frequent, and we have a lot of capacity there, but nonetheless it was devastating. Our state capital was flooded, and the road to recovery will be tremendous, and many of the things that I work on internationally I wish we had at home as well. So I'll turn over to the panel. What recommendations would you have?
The question that everyone has, every government has, or also every city has, is if you have $100 in your pocket, how do you spend them in order to maximize basically your risk management? How much of that $100 do you invest in mangrove afforestation? How much do you use to retrofit buildings? How much do you invest in an insurance premium? And how much do you keep aside for contingencies? And the answer to that question is unfortunately quite complex, and it is different from context to context. We are starting to learn about this in developing countries where we already have a track record of some experience. it's a little bit sequential design. No, we had in the 10 years ago we started planting trees, and then we started to add an element of insurance on top of it, and then we see a little bit how the combination of these different layers of protection make over a longer period of time people more resilient to new shocks that are coming in. So I think the first approach would be, really going into the data crunching mode and figuring out how has the city of Hong Kong been able to deal with these shocks in the past. Where did you have your losses and damages? And then, which investment envelopes are available in the government to work on relevant issues. But it's, I think, a very context specific job.
Yeah, I would say similarly for us with the Start Ready pot, we have also considered the idea of, for example, if a country makes an application to have some funds be prepositioned, whether they can actually put a portion of those funds into insurance. But there's been, I think, issues that we're exploring around the legality of that, the accounting, how to run around the accounting processes, the governance of the whole process, but it's something that we're exploring because I think it would be good to just diversify as well and not just like leave it as a pot, again, as another effort of stretching the funds. So I would say that's work in progress. For ARC, of course, that's not a Start Network program. We are a replica, joining forces with the government and the African Union agency that they set up. So yeah, I would say it's something that we're also still exploring. Like I said, we're in the second pool, but we are looking into it. But just looking at the legal issues, the accounting, the governance aspects. Thank you.
I would say community leadership is critical. And that's for two reasons. The first is because if your identification of the problem and solutions happens at the community level, it's more likely to be effective and to be what the community wants, which means they will actually use whatever the system is, the structures that have been put in place. And then the second reason why community leadership is so important is it's often a lot cheaper. It's often much easier to give a very, very small grant to a local organization to, for example, when it comes to heat waves, start community gardens on roofs that provide shade and cool down and avoid the urban heat island effect than it is necessarily to be spending at a central location where you have the massive infrastructure projects, which often are needed as well. But I think this investment in community-led action is absolutely critical.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. I would add maybe just a couple of other things in addition to making sure you have strong local community capacity to respond. I think there are two things that I would suggest. One is be careful to understand how the risk profile has changed. There are new hazards that we haven't experienced before, prolonged heat waves, for example, especially in cities. That may not be built into the way that a city or a government runs that are different. I mean, different things that we've never had before. And the second is, I think it's, Mexico, for example, has a very large sovereign wealth fund. And they will tell you that we can pay normally for the cost of disasters from the fund, but they're very diligent about using disaster risk finance because it brings discipline to the public purse. They assess the risks, they analyze the financial costs, and they use a risk layering strategy to access different instruments, including from their own budget, but also through insurance mechanisms and other contingency finance mechanisms like catastrophe drawdown facilities. And that risk layering for a government is really important. I would say one of the innovations in the humanitarian system that's been most exciting is moving from a risk layering that takes into account the overall cost of disasters to looking at how much money you need through the cycle of a shock. What do you need before for anticipatory action? What do you need right after a disaster, and what do you need for resilient recovery? And so that adds, I think, a really important layer of thinking in terms of how you manage both the financial side and the capacity side. I think we're at time now for this session, so I'd really like to thank the panel for an interesting discussion. Thanks for a great question. Thanks everybody online for joining today, and let's hope that the Loss and Damage Fund gets up and running effectively as soon as possible. Thank you.